Good afternoon. I think we can revert to the normal timetable this afternoon, have a break at 3 o'clock and then sit till 4:15. Carry on now, please, Ms. Graham.
Thank you very much. Just before lunch, we were talking about the minutes for the third Gold Group meeting. This was at 2015 on the 3rd of May, and I wondered if we could have those back on the screen. PS 03139. And we were talking about item 5 on the agenda, family concerns, at the bottom of page 2.
Yes.
And I was also going to ask you about the final task that is listed there. Family crave reassurance and are asking about witnesses, etc. They do not wish anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who is in London. First of all, do you remember that part of the discussion at the Gold Group?
I don't really, but obviously it's in the minutes, so that's what was stated.
Do you have any recollection about who would be expected to complete that task? There's no name given next to it.
Well, I think that Gold and everybody else needs to take cognizance, the second part of it at the very least, take cognizance of the fact that the family don't want anything publicised until they informed Mr. Bayo's mother. So it's absolutely taking cognizance of that. That's the family wish. That's what should happen.
As Gold Commander, would your expectation be that those wishes would be complied with?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And do you remember anyone discussing Mr. Bayo's mother being in London or arrangements that were being made by the family?
I can't. I do remember that. She was elsewhere than in Kirkcaldy, but obviously I can see that she was in London, but I don't remember that discussion in that great detail, no.
And in terms of someone giving the family reassurance, who would be responsible for that task? In your understanding of how things work, who would you think would deal with that task?
So, well, the flows should, they're engaged with the family, so the flow, well, I'm not sure now, obviously, whether the flows were actually engaged with the family at that stage. So, so Gary McEwan's has been to see the family, and presumably he's updating us that they want reassurance and are asking about witnesses, etc. And the fact that they don't want anything publicised. So, I suppose my question now is, was sufficient reassurance provided in terms of what they are asking for, and then did we comply with it? That's the, I don't know the answer to that at this moment in time.
Do you have any recollection
No,
about
I don't really.
the actions that were taken by the Gold Group after this was raised?
Well, I assume they're just about to come up, but not really, no.
Let's move on to the next section. So this is page 3. And completing item 3, so you've got a complete picture of what was under that heading. 5, sorry. Discussed that police did not know next of kin whilst Colette, partner of deceased, was at police station. Chief Superintendent discusses initial decision to have Police Scotland flows, but now hand over to Perk flows for arrangement to gain entry to a house of deceased, recollecting belongings for child. Discussion re-initial contact on phone from Perk. Chief Superintendent discusses family desperate to know about post-mortem, and also arrangements on having them conveyed to mortuary in Edinburgh. And then task to address all family issues raised. So again, that task to address all family issues raised, no one is allocated that task, or no named person is.
No, but my expectation would be that it would be from Gary McEwan to the appropriate individuals, which would involve family liaison officers if the family were to be conveyed to Edinburgh, to the mortuary.
We've heard evidence that Gary McEwan was concerned about the fact that flows hadn't been deployed to the family that day. And as a result of his concerns and the fact the family, Addie Johnson, brother-in-law of Shekabau, had known him and asked for him to attend, that he went to the family home after 6 o'clock in the evening. He explained that wasn't a normal thing that he would do, but in the particular circumstances he felt it was appropriate. I'm summarising. So he has, by the time of this Gold Group meeting, he's been to the family home. He's updating the Gold Group in relation to that meeting. So in terms of the tasks that are identified under this item in the minutes, who would you expect to be dealing with these, addressing the family issues that were raised?
Well, Gary McEwen was the person that was, and with the family, had most knowledge, so I wouldn't expect himself to be undertaking that, but I would expect him to delegate it to other people. And as I said, there's a bit of confusion about whether the flows were there or not, but ultimately that kind of information, conveying the family to the mortuary, ought to be the duties of the flows.
And in terms of your own expectations as Gold Commander, what would you have expected to be happening in relation to the family issues that are raised, including the arrangements to go to the mortuary?
Yeah, well, they've asked to go to the mortuary. I don't think there was any reason that they shouldn't go to the mortuary, so they ought to be conveyed there. That would be the appropriate thing to do. And
from your perspective, what was the purpose of taking the family to the mortuary?
Well, I mean, it's not outlined there, but I assume it's about identification. So.
And you mentioned an issue with the flows. Were you aware at this time that there was a lot of discussion going on about the flows, and Gary McEwen's given evidence that he was concerned about the flows and that no one had actually gone to see the next of kin?
Yeah, I mean, I think we discussed that yesterday at some point in terms of the length of time it took to get flows deployed, and that's absolutely right. So at this point, then, he's been to see the family. We're trying to understand exactly what the issues are, and we're tasking him in the first instance to delegate people to undertake the various roles that are identified there, including taking the family to the mortuary.
And to go back to the previous page, the information that the mother was in London and the family didn't wish anything to be publicised until they had had an opportunity to inform her. Do you have a recollection of being told that the mother was going to travel up from London up to Scotland?
I don't at this stage, but I probably was told. I was probably told as part of this here that the family didn't want publicity until the mother was informed in London, and probably as part of that discussion I was told that the mother was intended to attend in Kirkcaldy, but I can't specifically remember.
From your perspective, would that be a reasonable request for the family to make? Not to publicise things until they've informed his mother and when she returned,
of course,
came up?
Yes, exactly.
We've heard evidence from Caddy. She gave evidence to the inquiry. This is Shekabau's sister, Caddy Johnson, on day 34 of the inquiry, 31st of January, that they very quickly looked online for flights for the mother to travel up from London, and that the intention was she would get to Edinburgh about 2 or 3 in the afternoon on the Monday, the 4th of May. And she gave evidence that Shekabau's mother would be travelling up the next day. They made that clear, and they were willing to identify the body once she arrived in Scotland. And again, is that a reasonable approach for the family to take?
Yes, would think so.
And from a Police Scotland perspective, can you envisage any reasons why that request could not be complied with?
No, not at all.
We've heard that the body is really in the charge of in the custody of the Crown,
Yes.
and it's for them to organise the post-mortem.
Yes.
Can you envisage any hindrances to this request being complied with?
No, I can't, and I think the post-mortem was to be held on Monday afternoon anyway, so.
So if it was to be delayed, it wouldn't be delayed by much?
No, not at all.
We've heard evidence that the mother actually did fly up the following day to Edinburgh, so arrived in Edinburgh initially. Can you see any reason why the post-mortem couldn't have been delayed even slightly to allow identification?
Well, I can't, but I don't organise the post-mortem, so it might be a bit. Well, I'm now going to suppose that that's the wrong thing to do. So I don't know.
Is it a request that you would have felt in any way uncomfortable about making of the Crown or the pathologist?
No, not at all.
Can I ask you, in terms of the post-mortem, by that stage on the Monday, would that have been something that the police were still involved in progressing, or was that already at the stage of PERC having taken over? Do you have a view on that?
Well, I don't think that PERC had fully taken over the inquiry by the Monday. I think it was into the Tuesday before they were fully engaged with the inquiry. So at this stage, other people will be able to give you more detail about who was at the post-mortem and who was in between the two, the SIO, our SIO, Police Scotland SIO anyway, and the PERC, how much of a handover had taken place by the time that the post-mortem was taking place.
Right. Did you have a clear view at that time about whether it was Police Scotland that were making progress in relation to the post-mortem and arrangements, or PERC, or did you not have a clear view?
No, I didn't have a clear view at that stage.
So as Gold Commander, would you have been in a position to provide that strategic direction if you'd been invited to do so?
In terms of who was in charge of the
post-mortem, making arrangements with the family, that type of thing?
Well, I think that, yes, of course, there was an issue with that, but, as I said before, it's about the police service continuing with the investigation until the PERC is in a position to take over that investigation. I'm not sure at that point whether the PERC had enough staff and resource to be able to take over the investigation. So I assume on the Monday, so Sunday being day one, Monday would be that point that we would be trying to reposition so that the PERC was the lead organisation. But I'm not sure whether they were in a position to do that on the Monday or not.
I'll come back to the question of resourcing actually,
Yeah.
but before we leave this item on the agenda, can I go back to the comment about the family being concerned that early contact they had was purposely vague? We mentioned that earlier, just before lunch. We've heard evidence from Caddy in relation to the delivery of the death message, and I appreciate you weren't present at that, but I wonder if I can read out a passage of evidence that we've heard from Caddy and ask you for some comments on that, please. So if you can just give me a moment. Thanks. So Caddy Johnson gave evidence, as I've said, on day 34, 31st of January, and for those behind me, this is line 37 of the transcript. She says, and this comes from her inquiry statement, which she spoke to, "I feel it was appalling the way we were treated, because how can you come and deliver such information when you know that the very first question is, how did my loved one die? And yet you couldn't tell us. Why did they feel that they can come to our house to deliver such information without knowing the proper answer? Or why did they decide to just tell us whatever they want to say to us, and they thought that we will go with it or we will just believe it? I asked her to compare her experiences with her role in healthcare. She explained she works as a nurse, or did at the time. And she said, well, for me there was no compassion. They just came, they told me the news. Yes, they were calm, but I didn't feel no compassion, because if you're delivering such information, you should have the right words to tell me. You should have the true words to tell me, but that wasn't expressed to me. So for me there was no compassion. They just came, they did their job and just told me the news. Now, listening to that passage of evidence, I wonder if you have any concerns about the way the family were treated on the 3rd of May, if you'd like
Well,
to.
the family ought to be, as I've said many times, treated with fairness and respect. They ought to be given whatever information it is that we have that we can provide to them. And the family ought to feel that officers that attend are compassionate in terms of what's happened. And if that's not what's happened, I can only apologise, but I don't represent the organisation anymore, so, but these things should never happen.
Thank you. Can we, for the moment, go right back to the top of these minutes? Because these are the minutes from the Gold Group meeting at the end of this day. And we've heard from Gary McEwen about the way things had progressed by the evening on the 3rd of May. And we've heard about his visit to the family. And a moment ago you talked about the word resources, and I'd quite like to ask you about that. We've heard evidence from Pat Campbell about issues that he had. Now, he gave evidence on day 47 and expressed reservations about handing over the investigation to PERC due to their resourcing. He had concerns about their capacity to respond to such a significant incident. He didn't know when they would arrive, and he didn't know what resources they would have when they did arrive. And resources-wise, he gave evidence that his investigation had about 20 or 22 resources from Police Scotland. I think that's officers. And PERC turned up with 4 or 5. This was the first deployment of PERC, and it was a challenge. And he was reluctant to relinquish control of the incident and had a bit of trepidation. And he questioned whether it would have set the investigation back if they gave the handover to PERC. I'm interested in your views on those comments from Pat Campbell.
Well, he doesn't have any choice but to relinquish control. It's a PERC-led investigation, and he has to hand over to PERC as quickly as possible. PERC will make the decisions about how many resources that they've got there. We can't second judge the PERC because 4 or 5 officers turn up at Kirkcaldy office. You only need one strong leader to actually direct what's going on, and they can direct Police Scotland and use the 22 resources that we've got, or 17,000 that we've got across the force area, if that's what is asked of us. So, we ought to just get on with what our job is and allow the PERC to get on with what their job is. What the resourcing is, how they set themselves up, is entirely for them. I've said this a few times, we need an independent inquiry. And if that's initially started by 4 or 5 officers, well, so be it. But they can ask us to carry out, we want you to do these house to house, we want you to seize that CCTV. That can still be independent. We just go and take the CCTV and we hand it over to them, or we secure it so that it's available to them. You know, so I don't think what their resources are, you know, that we should be starting to worry too much about that. We ought to be doing what we should be doing, carrying out the investigation, stabilising everything, securing everything, and then being in a position to hand it all over to the PIRC. Every single investigation wouldn't be carried out for them. It can't be. They're never going to have the resources that Police Scotland's got to undertake an investigation. That doesn't mean to say that they can't carry out that investigation.
Thank you. Can I ask you, at this meeting, you'll see the list of names of who are present.
Yes.
We have other information available to the inquiry that a Jill Bolton addressed or spoke at a Gold Group meeting, this Gold Group meeting,
Right.
to confirm that flows would be key in obtaining information to allow reassurance messages or strategy to be developed and would be recorded within the community impact assessment. Now, first of all, can I ask, do you remember a Jill Bolton addressing the Gold Group meeting?
So I can't specifically, but Jill Bolton had a role in terms of equality and diversity, so I'm not surprised that we would have asked for a briefing from her to make sure that we understood all the issues in terms of that. It should have been recorded on whichever Gold Group meeting it is, and that's an oversight, and I should have challenged that. But anyway, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
So there's nothing unusual about the Gold Group inviting someone to come and address them or brief them on a particular topic?
No, if it's a really important issue, then she, as I say, she had a role at the training centre in terms of diversity, equality and diversity. So it was important to make sure we were up to date with all the various facets of that, and she would be, she could ask and challenge any decisions or any actions that were being taken, and to rectify any situation that we were involved in. So.
And in light of the fact you don't actually remember Jill Bolton being present, presumably you don't have any recollection of what happened in response to any briefing she may have given?
No, I don't.
Looking back now at where things were in the evening on the 3rd of May, do you think the Gold Group could have done more or developed further strategies in relation to delivering messages to the community?
We can always do more, there's no question about that. And we can't do enough in terms of communities. But I would hope from what we did, that there was sufficient there to actually go and engage with the community, deal with issues that were highlighted from the Gold Group meeting, and take that forward. Could the Gold Group do more? Could I have done more? Well, no doubt I could, and no doubt the Gold Group could. As I say, we can always do more, but I hope that what we did was sufficient at that time. But we'll no doubt learn.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at item 2, which is on page 2, top of page 2. This is factual update given by Pat Campbell. It says information to suggest that the deceased had an argument with his partner Colette Bell, and we've heard evidence from Colette Bell that when her statement was taken at Kirkcaldy Police Office, the police were, I think, quite insistent in relation to asking about whether there'd been an argument. She made it very clear to the inquiry there was no argument, but she, I think, felt, if I can summarise by saying, felt under a little pressure in terms of that line of questioning. Can you help us understand why this topic would be raised in the evening of the 3rd of May at the Gold Group meeting?
Well, so obviously Pat Campbell felt that it was pertinent in terms of what was happening. So the fact that Colette Bell was the partner, it was really important. So it was updating the goal group in terms of potentially the sensitivities round about what was being undertaken there.
And can you help us understand which hypotheses would this assist with or be relevant to?
Well, so obviously it's looking at the previous history and, what may have led to the cause of death. But, in terms of it being merely an argument, it's unlikely to have contributed. So, but, that was an update from Pat, that's Pat Campbell, that's what was being undertaken. So I don't know the detail of that. I mean, you would need to ask Pat where that, or you have anyway, but where that fitted into which hypothesis that fitted into.
Having heard from Colette Bell herself, she has expressed the view that she felt there was an attempt to find reasons to blame Sheku Bayo for his own death and to raise concerns about relationships that he had with his family, including Colette Bell. Was there any attempt or mindset to blame Sheku Bayo for his own death?
Well, not from a goal perspective, there definitely wasn't. But as I said before, I mean, it's not taking any particular course of action, but to follow the evidence wherever it takes you, gather all the evidence that you possibly can, and then you can make decisions. But what you shouldn't do at any stage is try to blame someone. You need to wait for the evidence. That's the bottom line.
Thank you. Can we move on to the next Gold Group meeting, which was the next day? Which I've put in a safe place. PS 03161. And this is at 12:30 on the 4th of May 2015. So the day after Mr. Bayo died, round about lunchtime.
Yep.
And we've looked at these before. This is an agenda. There's no, it is also minutes, but there's no list of who was present at the meeting. Now, it's been suggested that you were present at the meeting and your name is next to the terms of reference.
Yeah.
Were you present at this meeting?
I was, yes.
You were. This was at Kirkcaldy Police Station.
Yes, it was.
And do you remember attending this Gold Group meeting?
I remember attending the various Gold Group meetings, yes.
Can we look please at page 2? So this relates to item 3 on the agenda, which is the investigative process. This was spoken to by a DI Stuart Wilson. Page 2, and around, yes, it's actually at the bottom of the screen as we look at it. You see the items listed task. And the first of those says task, advice to be gained from PERC regarding the disclosure of the PM results to the officers involved in the incident. Supervisor to be identified to carry this disclosure out. And I'm interested in your recollection of this part of the meeting. Tell us what you remember.
Well, I think that potentially Gary McEwen wanted the officers informed of the PM results, and however it was important that advice was gained from the PIRC at that stage to make sure that that wasn't going to have any detrimental effect on their investigation. And if it wasn't, and it was appropriate to disclose the PM results, then that should be carried out by a supervisor.
Do you have any recollection of who the supervisor was to be
No,
identified?
No.
So your recollection is it was Gary McEwen that wanted the officers
I'm
informed?
pretty sure it was, yes.
And do you remember his reasons for wanting the officers informed?
Well, it was probably, so I think it was in relation to, giving the officers an update on the position and, where the investigation was.
We've heard some evidence that the officers were not willing to give statements without information on the post-mortem results. Do you remember that being discussed?
Well, the officers definitely weren't prepared to give statements. I don't recollect any discussion about it being until either they got legal advice or they knew of the post-mortem results.
You don't remember any comment of that being made?
No.
What would your view be about any suggestion that they wanted these results before they would give statements?
Well, they should give operational statements without any of that. In terms of the subsequent interviews and statements, then it may well be that you would want to disclose. That would be part of the interview strategy, but may well be that you would want to disclose parts of the post-mortem result if that was important in terms of your interview strategy. But I don't think that it's appropriate for officers in the first instance to be saying that they're not going to give any statements until they have the results of the post-mortem.
And why do you say you don't think it's appropriate for officers to be saying that?
Well, they're obliged to give, it's incumbent on them to give operational statements. And these statements ought to be given long before a post-mortem is carried out.
Before lunch, we talked about the hypotheses and the race hypotheses, as I was calling it. And you explained that the investigation couldn't exclude a race hypothesis without the statements of the officers. That would be an important part of the evidence gathering.
Yep.
And yesterday we talked about conferral and avoiding that because it could have an impact on statements. Was there any part of this discussion where that aspect was addressed, that perhaps you would have wanted the statements from the officers prior to giving them any information?
No, as far as I was concerned, they're refusing to give statements, and so this was a request at the goal group meeting to provide information regarding the post-mortem. And so it's pushed, is it appropriate, and can we have advice from the PIRC in terms of their view of providing information in relation to the post-mortem.
Did you or anyone else at the Gold Group express concerns that giving officers information about the post-mortem results before their statements have been obtained might not be the best idea?
Well, yes, but the outcome of the post-mortem was unascertained, so it really doesn't provide much information to the officers or anybody else. It tells everybody that there's more information to be gained, there's more investigation to be carried out. So from that perspective, it probably doesn't make much difference in terms of knowing that information.
But when this meeting was going on at 12:30 on the 4th of May, the post-mortem hadn't been conducted at that stage,
Right.
and the initial post-mortem report was available on the 2 days later.
Right.
So 12, I think at the top, tell me if we're wrong, but at the top of the minutes we see that it should say 12:30, I think, on the 4th of May.
Yeah.
So as I understand the evidence, there wouldn't have been any information available to you at that time.
There's no information available.
No.
Yes, okay, so there's no information available at that time, sorry.
And so in a situation where there's no statements, no use of force forms, no sprays, use of spray
Yes, I
forms,
have.
and the post-mortem will be conducted later the same day, and there's a discussion about giving officers information about the post-mortem.
Yes,
I'm just wondering now, in hindsight, do you have concerns about that request to give the officers information?
yes. So at that point, there was no information to give in any event. So I assume then it's a case of speaking to the PIRC and understanding what information it is that ought to be given to the officers. But fairly obviously, we wouldn't find that out until later on when the post-mortem was actually held. So.
And do you know who took that, if we go back to that task, advice to be gained from PERC, who took that task forward? Sorry, this is on page 2, the task we looked at before, just there we are,
No,
it's
I'm
on
not-
the screen. Do you
I
know
don't-
who took that task forward?
I don't.
So this item on the agenda, investigative process, item 3, was spoken to by DI Stuart Wilson. Would it have been DI Stuart Wilson that would have taken that task forward, or would it have been PERC? Well, someone had to speak
Someone
to PERC.
had to speak to PIRC, so I assume we would need to speak to him to understand whether in fact he did contact PIRC in relation to this.
Were you given any updates after this Gold Group meeting about what the advice from PERC was, if any?
I don't recollect that.
Did anyone come back to you as Gold Commander to sign off on releasing this information to officers?
I don't think so. I don't remember, but I don't think so.
Would you have expected to be addressed or briefed on this matter?
No, I think that, back to what I said previously, I mean, it was a case of a discussion with the PIRC and understanding exactly what was to be disclosed and then making that disclosure, or whether it was appropriate to make that disclosure.
But ultimately, when it says advice to be gained from PERC, would it have been PERC that took the ultimate decision?
Well, at that point it's their investigation, so, you know, they know and understand what it is that they want to glean from the officers and whether it's appropriate to disclose the PM results or not.
Thank you. And we've heard evidence that the family, we've looked at the previous minutes about them being desperate to know about the post-mortem.
Yep.
And we've heard evidence that the family did not know that a post-mortem had been carried out until the Tuesday, the 5th of May, so the day after a meeting with their solicitor. Does it concern you? We've also heard evidence that the officers were given information about post-mortem results on the evening of the 4th of May. Does it concern you that the family weren't told that a post-mortem had even taken place until after the police officers?
It absolutely does.
And why does that concern you?
Well, the family should have been informed first.
We've heard other evidence that the family should have been the priority in terms of sharing that information, and they should have been told first.
They should.
Who would have been responsible for sharing that information with the family about post-mortem results?
Well, it should be the flows, and that would be the normal course of events, but
Would that be the PERC flows or the police?
well, it depends who was engaged. Sorry, it depends who was engaged with the family at that time. I can't recollect which flows were engaged with the family at that time, but whoever was engaged with the family ought to have been telling the family about the post-mortem and also telling them the results.
And who's responsible for the flows?
Well, ultimately the SIO.
And so if it's Police Scotland, it would be someone like Pat Campbell, and if
Yes.
it's PERC, it would be whoever the equivalent of
That's
Pat
right.
Campbell would
That's
be,
right. That's right.
depending on the point of handover.
That's it.
We spoke previously about Mr. William or Billy Little,
Yes.
and you mentioned him
Yeah.
in your evidence. Could we perhaps look at your inquiry statement, please?
Yeah.
And I'm interested in paragraph 296. Sorry, 296. Thank you. And the inquiry team asked you to, you say you've been told William Little of Perk states the following. So this is a Perk statement from Billy Little, and you were allowed to look at that, asked to look at that and ask questions.
Correct.
So let's just look at 296. And it says about 12:35 hours, same date, whilst en route to Edinburgh City Mortuary, and this is Billy Little, I was contacted by ACC Nicholson. During this telephone call, Mr. Nicholson indicated that he had some concerns regarding the handover of the investigation from Police Scotland to the Perk. In particular, it could be viewed that Police Scotland were still dealing with this incident. I advised him that I had been in contact with Detective Superintendent Campbell, and arrangements were being made for the handover in line with the terms of reference. I also assured him that Mr. Campbell was fully aware that the Perk were the sole investigators of the interaction between the deceased and the police. So this relates to a conversation that you had with Mr. Little. Can we look at the next paragraph, please? 297. This is you now speaking in response. I'm now not denying the conversation took place. The gold meeting was 12:30. The call might have been 12:25 or whatever. I do remember that call. His statement jogged my memory. It's straightforward. It's obvious that I had concerns. I thought Police Scotland were involved in too many aspects, and I wanted reassurance that Perk were leading the inquiry and that they were dictating what elements they were going to undertake and what Police Scotland were going to undertake. I think I was reassured that that's what I wanted to hear. Can you tell us a little more about these concerns that you had?
Well, I just felt from a Police Scotland perspective that we were still, from the information I was gleaning, that we were still involved in many aspects of the inquiry. Now, of course, that might be fine as long as the Perk have an understanding of what inquiries they want to be involved in and what inquiries Police Scotland are involved in. So purely and simply at that stage, and I assume that I've made the call before the goal group meeting to understand exactly what was happening, and to provide myself with reassurance that the Perk were leading on the inquiry and that they were undertaking the elements that they wanted to undertake, just what I've said in my statement there. And so he told me that, well, as it says in my statement there, he had reassured it. It says in his that he was able to reassure me that they were involved with the investigation to the extent that they believe that they ought to have been. So.
And let's just look at that previous paragraph.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we can't get everything on
No.
the screen, but we see there that he says about 12:35 there is this call and you'd expressed concerns.
Yeah.
I advised him that I'd been in contact with Campbell and arrangements were being made for the handover in line with the terms of reference. I also assured him that Mr. Campbell was fully aware that Perk were sole investigators. And so reading that, had there been a handover? Had there been a handover? Because what this says is arrangements were being made for the handover. Had there actually been a handover prior to this
Well,
Fourth
from
gold
that,
group.
it certainly doesn't feel like it, and I suppose that being on the ground, it didn't feel like there was a full handover. Now, of course, the PIRC were there to some extent, and as I've said already, it's not about the numbers that they have on the ground, it's about leadership and just speaking to the people who are leading at that time. So I assume that Billy Little, I don't know if he was the SIO at that stage, but obviously I was given his details, so I contacted him to give myself reassurance that we were on the right track in terms of who's carrying out this investigation. Because as I said before, the sooner the PIRC are involved carrying out the investigation, the better.
Did it clearly concerned you? Were you surprised that there hadn't been a handover by 12:30, the
Well-
fourth gold group meeting on the 4th of May?
Well, it depends what the handover. So if you go back to the 3rd of May when they arrived, and so I had a meeting. So I think I had scheduled from the first gold group meeting. I think I had scheduled a meeting for later in the afternoon, but I brought it forward because they arrived. So I wanted them to be there so that they knew and understood exactly what was going on, so that they had all the information at a strategic level that I had, and then they could go and speak to the SIO and sort out between the PIRC and the SIO exactly how that was being taken forward. That's what I believed was happening from the afternoon of the Sunday. But then, I've got to be careful. I've got to be careful because Police Scotland's got a lot of police officers and a lot of investigators. So, we could and we would, if we had an investigation, apply as many, officers as we wanted. I don't suppose that's entirely right, but so we could apply a lot of resource, so it was, I suppose, a bit more sluggish than what it would be if it was a purely Police Scotland inquiry. But, there's an expectation that there would be a handover and that the PIRC would be involved at the earliest stage that they could become involved, and that they had enough resource to be able to take it forward in the way that they wanted to take it forward.
Thank you. So let me just go through some of that further. I think when we looked at the first gold group minutes, there was an entry at the end that said the next meeting will be at 4 o'clock.
Yes.
But then when we looked at the second gold group meeting minutes, they were at 14:40.
Yes.
Is that, you brought it forward because I think you also said PIRC had arrived by then.
That's
They were in Kirkcaldy
That's
by the second gold group meeting at 14:40, and they attended that meeting.
That's correct.
So was your expectation that that would be the point at which there was a handover to PIRC once they were in the building and present?
Well, it would be different. I mean, it's a transition rather than, as you would understand it, that I would come over and put in the folder and hand it over to you. I mean, that isn't going to happen. So there's a whole load of inquiries ongoing. So it's a transition from when they have it, when we have it initially to when they take it over. So that could take a couple of days, but you would expect on day 2, the Monday, to see considerable activity, and then on day 2 and then day 3 even more activity, and so as their activity escalates, our activity ought to de-escalate. So we're less involved. I would expect to see less of our people being involved in it and more of their people. But of course, if they're asking us to carry out some of the investigation, then that might be a slower process, because if they ask us to see CCTV, they ask us to do house-to-house inquiries, and on it goes, that actually might go on for a couple of weeks before we actually carry out all the house-to-house inquiries, before we seize the CCTV. But I would expect, well, I don't know, but I would expect them to be carrying out house-to-house inquiries in the close proximity to the actual incident. And then there would be a decision about us, seizing the CCTV. So it might be us that did that, because we would, you'd be worried that it would get destroyed. We'd written over. Depends on, how CCTV might not last that long. So it would be a transition. in terms of from our point of view to their point of view. And that's not any different to where we were in the past with an outside force taking over. It would take a number of days for that handover to take place. Yeah,
Is it fair to say you would have expected leadership to have been demonstrated by PERC from an early stage?
Yes.
Even though the Police Scotland would still be supporting that investigation, perhaps?
All you need is one strong leader, and then they can orchestrate what's going on. So they ask us, they can sit with our SIO, they can tell the SIO what they want. The SIO will delegate that down to whoever, or they can instruct our people. I mean, there's no difficulty with that whatsoever.
So, looking back now, you've mentioned one strong leader. Do you feel that that's what was provided by PERC?
Well, I think the leadership changed, unfortunately, over that period of time. So,
tell us about that.
Well, I think it was Keith Harrower at the beginning, and I think, and it's Billy Little at that point. Now, I don't know the reason for that, and actually that might not have detracted. I just don't know. It's the truth of the matter. But I would have just liked to have seen continuity and feet on the ground.
We've heard in relation to Police Scotland that it's better not to change SIOs. It's better to have one SIO dealing with an investigation,
Yes.
have that continuity there. Is that something you would have liked to have seen with PERC?
Yeah, the PERC won't be any different to Police Scotland. There will be reasons. So we had Pat Campbell, but we might have found that Pat Campbell was going on holiday in 5 days or whatever, and we would have to change. But the PERC might be exactly the same. But would I like continuity? Absolutely. It's absolutely the best way to carry out an investigation of this scale.
And can you explain to the chair, how does that, you said it's the best way to carry out an investigation of this scale. Does that make it better, or why is that the case?
Well, because it's really difficult to articulate every single aspect of the inquiry to another individual, and for that person, especially if it's a scale. If it's a very small inquiry, then it's probably not a difficulty. But with the various aspects that there are to this inquiry, there'll be nuances all over the place that the SIO will pick up from day one and all the way through the inquiry. Trying to hand that over to someone else just makes it really difficult. So continuity is really important. I mean, you can manage that with a deputy SIO. So SIO and deputy SIO, and then if the SIO has to change over, at least the deputy will be able to have that continuity or provide that continuity.
So can things get lost in the transition?
Yes. Well, that would be the worry, whether it actually does or not, but it would be a worry that's what happens.
And in this particular scenario, we had a handover from Pat Campbell to Keith Harrower and then to Billy Little.
Well, it feels like we were in a transition where Pat Campbell was the continuity from beginning through, but then we had Keith Harrower at the initial briefing and then transitioning through to Billy Little on day 3, I think. Day 2 or day 3.
This conversation that is described is on the 4th of May, which is the Monday.
Monday, yes.
And it's round about 12:30, round about the time of the 4th Gold Group meeting. Now, in relation to the minutes of this 4th Gold Group meeting, I wonder if we can go back to those. This is the PS 03161. I said to you at the outset, there's no list of who's present, but we see some names mentioned after each item. So you're named, Gold Strategy. D.I. Stuart Wilson is named. Stuart Wilson is named at 3. McEwen is named. Shepherd is named. And someone, Conrad Trickett and Alan Seath are named, and again Shepherd. I think after that it just says all as part of the discussion, so perhaps no in particular individual was addressing it. I asked previous witnesses, were PERC actually at this meeting?
I don't think they were, but I don't know. And obviously there should have been a list of attendees. My practice always was to go around the table and each person to identify themselves. It looks like whoever's taking the minutes has decided that they would write the officer's name beside the heading. And of course that's not the best, because there may have been people there that haven't spoken. So, but I would expect that there was a full list of attendees at some stage in terms of the actual meeting itself.
But your recollection now is that PERC weren't?
I can't remember PERC being there, and I don't think that would have been phoning Billy Little on his road, presumably to the post-mortem then, if they were in attendance at the meeting.
Right. Certainly that was what he said. He was en route to the mortuary. So if there'd been anyone from PERC there, would you probably have discussed matters with them at the meeting instead of phoning Billy Little?
Yes, I would.
Looking back now, was this something that added to your concerns? There was mention of, I think you said in your inquiry statement, there were too many aspects that were causing you concern, and you said you had expected to see more activity from PERC. Was this something else that added to your concerns, the fact that no one from PERC was actually at this Gold Group meeting?
Well, I mean, that was part of, I suppose that I'm sitting at a strategic level, but you'll get a feel, in terms of the PERC, you want to feel that you have to answer questions, that there's a bit of pain in terms of having to provide what it is that you're having to provide, and making sure that you support everything that they're doing. So, and I just didn't have that feeling that there was the demands that I thought that we should have. Not at the end of the day, the PERC are carrying out the investigation, and so from my perspective, it's a real fine balance of being intrusive and feeling that I'm putting pressure on anyone in the PERC in any way whatsoever. So I absolutely don't want anybody to feel that during any discussion that's what it's about. It's about just reassurance from our perspective, that from Police Scotland perspective anyway, that the investigation is progressing, and it's progressing in the way that the PERC wanted to progress, and that we aren't overstepping the mark in terms of what it is that that they would want to undertake. So it's about having that control of everything that's going on.
So I think the word you used earlier was sluggish. You felt there was the response from PERC, or the actions were more sluggish, and more so than a police inquiry would have been at this stage.
Yes.
Is that your recollection?
Yes, but I did caveat that by saying, the number of resources that we've got. The PERC could never have the number of resources that that we have. That if they had the resources that were able to carry out every single inquiry in terms of this, most of the year they would be sitting in an office somewhere in East Kilbride with nothing to do. So that's just not value for money. So. But they need to have enough resource that they can undertake this inquiry, but use resources from elsewhere. So it doesn't need to be necessarily Police Scotland. They can draw on resources from elsewhere, so to carry out their investigations. So it's a small team. It's providing leadership, and it's carrying out an effective investigation. That's what you want them to be doing. So, I was trying to balance what I was saying by. From Police Scotland, if on day one we would apply, well, it was 22 resources were mentioned, we could apply 100 resources to it if that's what we wanted to do. So we would draw them from elsewhere, but But we could apply that. The PIRC aren't in a position to do that, and you wouldn't expect them to be in a position to do that.
We heard from Gary McEwen that when he declared a critical incident, that in theory he could have all the resources available that he needs. And in fact, that could be from anywhere in Scotland, in
Yes.
theory. And he could even ask for officers through mutual aid from elsewhere nationally.
In the country, yes.
So that's the capacity that Police Scotland had,
Yes.
which couldn't be replicated
No,
by
absolutely
PERC.
not.
But at the same time, as I understand your evidence today, Police Scotland were to be supportive of PERC and the investigation, and were prepared to provide resources to PERC should they require them or
Yep.
request them. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, I'm conscious of the time, and the chair did say he would like to resort to our normal process. So if I may, I will ask to speak to the chair now at the moment on the screen. And good afternoon. I hope that perhaps this is an appropriate moment to adjourn for the afternoon break.
Yes, we'll take a 15-minute break now.
Thank you.
Yes, carry on, please, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. There's something I'm going to come back to, but I'm waiting for a hard copy to arrive. So I'll move on for the moment if you don't mind. I would like to ask you about the situation after there was a handover from Police Scotland to Perk. And you've explained that that would not be a fine dividing line, it would be a transitional period, and it may take some time depending on the tasks that were being done. But once the handover had taken place to Perk and they were leading the investigation, and subject to support that Police Scotland were providing, was it Perk investigators who were essentially running the investigation, perhaps with support, but largely taking the lead, taking charge of matters, directing, strategizing? Was it that was up to Perk?
Yes, that's right.
Now, had at any point in your role as Gold Commander, was it brought to your attention that there was someone called a Mr. John Sallins, who we've heard may have been a private detective or a precognition officer, and who was going round speaking to possible witnesses? Did you hear anything of that?
No.
I'm interested in what your view would have been if from a Police Scotland perspective, if you'd heard that a person had, such as a private detective, had been going around speaking to witnesses about the Shekubio incident in the early period, would that have caused you any concerns?
Well, it depends on what the purpose of that was. So was it on behalf of a lawyer representing any of the individuals, or was it just a private detective going round for I don't know what purpose? If that's the case, then it's wholly inappropriate, and Police Scotland ought to have taken action to, or the PIRC taken action to prevent that from happening.
Now, we've not heard from Mr. Sallins at this stage, but my understanding is that he was engaged by Peter Watson, who is a lawyer representing both individual officers and the Scottish Police Federation.
Right.
And it may or may not be the case that this step was taken and arrangements put in place in anticipation that there would have been a fatal accident inquiry instructed at some point by the Crown. Yep. Now, we know that there was never an FAI, but in anticipation of that happening, because there'd been a death after police contact, that was at least a possibility, and perhaps may have been viewed as mandatory at that stage. So with that extra background information, would it have caused you any concern that someone was going around?
I think that we would have contacted a fiscal to have a bit of a discussion about what the view was. Mm-hmm. But at that stage, whether that would be a discussion between ourselves and the fiscal, or whether it would be a discussion between the PIRC and the fiscal. But I would anticipate that there should be some discussion, at that stage. There's, and I'm not sure which fiscal was involved at that stage, but I would anticipate that there would have been some discussion to understand, whether that should be carried out, and what steps could be taken to either allow that to happen or to prevent it from happening if it was believed that it was going to undermine the investigation.
Right. And so would the concerns have been it potentially could have undermined the investigation in some way?
Yes, absolutely.
And you said to consider what steps could have been taken to stop it. What, as far as you know, what steps could have been taken to stop? Thank you. I think this may be my hard copy arriving.
Well, I assume that from a legal perspective that fiscal would speak to Peter Watson in terms of what was actually happening and have a better understanding perhaps than we could have of, you know, what was going on, why it was going on, and then get a fiscal's view in terms of whether it should continue or not. But the fiscal presumably could speak to Peter Watson and instruct him. It's, you know, it's their investigation at that stage. But you know, there may well be legal support, legal, you know, whatever, for him to carry that out. I don't know, but sensible course of action would be to have a conversation with a fiscal to better understand the legal implications of what was going on.
Would Police Scotland have considered speaking to witnesses that had maybe been approached by Mr. Salins to see what the nature of the discussion with them had been? Well,
I don't know, but well, so back to, you know, what I said was I would hope we would have a discussion with the fiscal and then have an understanding of what it was that we ought to do, and then if that in the round was what was suggested, that we go back and find out what Mr. Salins was about, then that's what we would do. But you know, it's pretty, you know, so there's Police Scotland, there's the PIRC, you know, Police Scotland being careful about how, you know, they don't undermine the PIRC investigation, and then obviously a third party, because normally in any other incidents, what you would have is you would have police carry out the investigation, the report to the Crown, and then defence become involved or lawyers become involved, and then it's open to them to go and recognise witnesses, take statements of witnesses. That would be I think the normal course of what would happen. But the truth is, I don't know on what basis that this was being undertaken.
And nothing like this was brought to your attention?
I absolutely don't remember it being taken.
And if the police had spoken to a witness and that witness explained that he'd become concerned that the gentleman was making comments about Sheku Bayo, which were unflattering, if I can describe it in that way, would that have caused you concern?
Yes.
Can you explain why?
Well, I mean, why would anybody be making comments that are unflattering at that stage, at this sensitive period? It's beyond belief.
Right.
It's appalling.
And would you be concerned about the impact on the investigation?
Yes, of course. You know, if these these are witnesses that the PIRC or the police expect to give evidence, and we've got someone going around and engaging them in whatever fashion, and which doesn't sound like a very good fashion, then that ultimately may well undermine the investigation.
Right. And if you had heard from another witness who became concerned that people were knocking on her door and actually took the step that she'd stopped answering the door to people, would that have caused concern for you in relation to the investigation?
Well, it gives me concern on a number of different levels. No person in this country should be frightened to answer their door. So, and of course, it gives me concern as far as the investigation is concerned.
And what would those concerns be in relation to any impact on the investigation?
Well, it obviously impacts on the witness. So, you know, so I don't know what the witness evidence is, or was, and you know how that would impact directly. But you know, people otherwise than the police going round chapping on people's doors and asking them questions about an inquiry that's ongoing doesn't feel like a good way to be going about their business.
Would it cause you any concern if the possible witnesses gained the impression that this gentleman was carrying out an investigation for Police Scotland?
Yeah, it would cause me serious concern.
And why would that be?
Well, he's creating an impression that he's a police officer. I think from the name he was an ex-police officer, but of course that would cause me concern. They need anybody that takes or speaks to a member of the public ought to identify who they actually are and why they want to carry out these investigations.
Thank you. Could you give me one moment, please?
I certainly will.
I may come back to that in a moment. I've now got my hard copy of a document, and it was something we were discussing earlier before the break, and I just want to follow up with that. So this is what I have in front of me is a daybook used by Nicola Shepherd.
Okay.
And have you also been given a hard copy of this?
Yes.
Now, I don't think this will be on the playlist for today, so I'm not in a position to display it on the screen. But for those listening behind me who have it, it's PS 10011. And as you've told us, Nicola Shepherd was involved in matters relating to community impact, and the daybook says at the top of it, community impact and reassurance group, and she mentions Chief Superintendent McEwen, and there's a number of topics and such like that she's dealing with in relation to community impact. Can I ask you to look at, sorry, my pages aren't numbered. Page 4. And this is headed up staff meeting. Chief Superintendent, Superintendent Milton, Amanda Given, Federation, me taking the minute. And it's a meeting, it appears to have been chaired by Chief Superintendent McEwen.
Yes.
And then on the next page, page 5, it says PM, cause of death, unexplained, pending toxicology. And it then says no evidence of any significant blunt force trauma. So this is just above halfway down
I see it, yeah.
the page. And this follows on from the conversation we were having before the break about police officers being advised about the post-mortem. And the outcome of that post-mortem. And I think I explained to you that initially the view was cause of death was unascertained pending investigations.
Yes.
But you will see that here it does mention PM cause of death unexplained pending toxicology. But in addition to that, information was obtained after the post-mortem that there was no evidence of any significant blunt force trauma. And as I understand the evidence that's been led before the inquiry, officers were advised on the evening of the 4th of May, so the Monday, not just that the post-mortem was unascertained cause of death pending investigations, but that there'd been no evidence of any significant blunt force trauma. And so they were given some additional information about the outcome of the post-mortem.
Yep.
Essentially given information that ruled out the possibility that blunt force trauma had caused the death of Mr. Bayo. Now, we've heard evidence in the inquiry from a PC Tomlinson, who told the chair that he had struck Mr. Bayo to the head 2 or 3 times with his baton, and that he had in addition struck his arms or body 2 or 3 times with his baton. And he gave evidence to the chair and explained that when he returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office, he was upset, and he was upset that striking him with the baton had perhaps contributed to the ultimate outcome. Now, I wonder, in light of that, we've obviously talked about the officers. You've given evidence about the officers being told about the post-mortem on the Monday evening before the family. We also talked about the fact that the officers hadn't given evidence, hadn't given statements to PERC until the 4th of June, a month later. Seeing now there that they were also given evidence about, given information that the death was not caused by any significant blunt force trauma, does that information cause you any concerns?
Yeah, I think it's...
about them getting, it wasn't just simply the death is unascertained.
Well, I think that's too much information at that stage without having provided statements. Because you would want to marry up the statements with the post-mortem outcomes. So, you know, declaring that it's unexplained or unascertained as it actually was, then I don't see any difficulty with that. That's fine. That's keeping everybody up to date with what's going on, but without disclosing any evidence. What it means and what it says is no evidence of any significant blunt force trauma. You know, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't trauma, and I think as was already said, you know, the pathologist, you know, will say that there could be, you know, no signs externally, but there may well be at some later stage signs internally. You know, so, you know, after a few days, it may well be that bruising becomes relevant, or, you know, that it's easier to see. So, so in my opinion, it's a bit early to disclose that information.
So, as Gold Commander, obviously this topic was raised at the 12:30 meeting on the 4th.
Yeah.
As you can see, things developed after the post-mortem took place. Would you have wanted to have been briefed on this issue before information was given to police officers?
Well, so I think, well, what I wanted to happen, and we saw that, was that PERC would be consulted on, you know, on what was the officers were to be told in terms of the post-mortem. So I absolutely can't recall having any discussion about that whatsoever. But you know, so I don't know whether there was agreement between the PERC and the SIO or whatever. But you know, from my perspective, as I already said, I think that full information is too early to provide to the officers at the very least. So
if they had come back to you and asked, should we disclose this, what would your response have been?
I would say, well, give me the rationale for doing that, you know, and if there was a really good rationale, that might be absolutely fine. But in the main, I would be saying, well, you know, we've not got statements, we haven't got an understanding of exactly what each officer's going to say, you know, and does that give them information that would allow them to, and obviously it hasn't, because the officer has honestly told exactly what's happened, but it would be my concern that someone had struck Mr. Beale with a baton and then wouldn't disclose that at a later stage. So, but, you know, it feels like that's probably not what's happened in any event, so it might not be as damaging as it looks like it could be.
But it could have been.
It could have been damaging.
And would your concern at that stage be not to cause any possible damage, or to avoid causing any possible damage to the investigation?
It's back to what I said. You know, from a policing perspective, we need to make sure that we secure everything, we don't lose anything, don't lose any evidence, and hand that over so that a proper, effective, independent investigation can be carried out. So. And then everything that we do ought to be in discussion with the PERC about what it is that we're going to disclose to the officers, how we're going to go about, you know, the interviews based on the fact that we hadn't got the initial statements, and just get that agreement and understanding.
Thank you. Now, we were talking before I got my hard copy of the situation regarding Mr. Salins, and I was putting some evidence to you about, and I think I used the word unflattering. I was having some checks made on the actual evidence that we heard, and I just want to tell you what that was, in case it changes anything that you said. So the evidence was from a Kevin Nelson, and for those behind me, his inquiry statement is SBPI 00014. And the inquiry has evidence from Mr. Salins through his inquiry statement, as well as orally, that, through Kevin Nelson, I should say, that Mr. Salins told him negative things about Sheku Bio. And in oral evidence, he said he described Mr. Salins as sprinkling seeds to try and influence him negatively about Sheku Bio. So I think I used the word unflattering comments, but that is the description given by a witness, Mr. Nelson, who's also given oral evidence to the inquiry. Is there anything in there that changes any of the evidence that you've...
No, not at all. It reinforces exactly what I said.
Thank you very much. Can we go back to your inquiry statement, please? And I'd like to move on to paragraph 244. This relates to, I have a number of questions about equality and diversity. This means taking account of the ethnicity of the deceased and his family, ensuring there is an understanding of that, ensuring a knowledge of what cultural issues there might be. It's having an understanding of their background, how they're dealt with, how they expect to be dealt with, and the kind of things they would want to update the fiscal on in relation to the death and future funeral arrangements. In the round, it's having that understanding of what cultural issue there might be, how to deal with the family and various aspects. Most flows will have an awareness of equality and diversity issues, but if that's reinforced, then I think that's good practice. You clearly have an understanding of the importance of ethnicity, diversity, equality issues. In your role in Police Scotland at that time, did you have obligations in relation to equality and diversity?
So I had safer communities. So that was more in relation to engaging with communities and the public, but in engaging with the various communities in terms of ethnicity. So that all came under my remit.
And did you have particular responsibilities, for example, under the Equalities Act, in terms of assessing the statistics for Police Scotland or anything of that sort?
Sorry, so in statistics in relation to
equality and diversity, in relation to ethnicity, in relation to bias, anything along those lines?
So as part of what we did, we reviewed crime reports to make sure that there was an appropriate response. So I had a small department of very few people, but nonetheless focused on racially motivated criminality. And offences. So that group had a look through crime reports on a day-to-day basis to make sure they were being appropriately managed, that we knew understood what the issues were, and whether from a central perspective that we could support the local division and local people in terms of giving the appropriate response to the individuals, the families, the community that was concerned.
What was the name of this small department?
Well, it was within Safer Communities.
Right, I see. And Was that, those working in the department, were they available as a resource to other areas to maybe come and seek advice and guidance?
Yes, absolutely.
And did they have any role in analysing differentials between treatment of people such as black men?
Well, I'm not sure. You need to ask them about that. But do you mean in terms of the police response to that?
Yes.
Well, whether they went into it in that amount of detail or not, I can't tell you now. But they explored crime reports. They fed back in terms of the investigation that was carried out, and support whichever division it was in terms of what the cultural issues might be, and an overview of if there were instances of that crime either across the country or locally. So it would be a view in that way, but with their background and knowledge, then being able to support the local community to provide an effective response to crime reports, reports of racially motivated crime, whether we had spikes or whatever.
Can I ask you to look at paragraph 49 of your inquiry statement?
Yeah.
You say, I've been asked if race and discrimination were factors in oversight of reports. I think it probably was. We're recording and monitoring all the statistics. I'll need to go back to that time to look at the package of what was being monitored. You've got a hard copy if you want to look around that paragraph, but can you tell us a little bit more about the statistics that were being recorded and monitored?
I can't remember now, to be honest. I mean, I said that, so I'm pretty sure that we were recording and monitoring statistics, but I can't tell you at this stage, exactly what was being recorded. Right. We'd need to go back and, get from Police Scotland what was being recorded at that stage, but I can't remember now.
But this would have been something that the people, your department in safer communities would perhaps be able to assist us with.
I think so, yeah. Yes.
Can I ask you what your recollection is of the procedure in May 2015 for any officers who would wish to report concerns regarding potential racism by another officer?
Well, they would initially could report it to a supervisor, and then from there an investigation could be instigated, and depending on what the outcome of that was, whether it was criminal or non-criminal, then it would proceed either to Procurator Fiscal or it would be dealt with internally.
And was that process or procedure well known amongst officers?
Well, I hope so, but we would need to ask the officers themselves, I suppose, whether it was or not. But
we've heard it suggested that perhaps there was under-reporting in Police Scotland in 2015. Would you agree with that?
That's entirely possible.
Did you have experience of dealing with any complaints or allegations of racist behaviour by police officers?
I did, yes. Can
you tell us a little bit more about your experience of?
Well, my experience, I suppose my experience is that, your previous question was about underreporting. I've no doubt there will be underreporting. Officers will not want to report on their colleagues. Will be the starting point of that. But we have had people come forward and report racially motivated incidents, and and they've been inquired into. So I've had officers under an officer anyway, or at least one officer under my command who was racially discriminated against, so that was dealt with, and so that was dealt with.
Was that by another officer?
Yes.
And when was that?
20. I think it was probably in times of, was it Strathclyde Police? So it'd be prior to 2013.
Right. Prior to the death of Shekobayo?
Yes, sir.
And you've said it was Strathclyde Police. Was this when you were in your role in Strathclyde rather than in Fife?
Yes.
And was there disciplinary action taken against this officer alleged to have been acting discriminatorily?
Well, so I don't remember the outcome of that, to be honest, but action would have been taken against officers in terms of racially motivated incidents or discrimination. I don't have the record of that, and you would need to research that in terms of Police Scotland, but in terms of what I recollect, someone reporting a racially motivated incident and then or discrimination, and then that being taken forward, so yeah.
And how can you help the chair understand how often that was something that landed on your desk?
No,
or?
not very often at all. It was at that stage because that officer worked for me, was under my command, but it's not something that that happened that often, and certainly not from my perspective. But it may well be that there were reports through the Deputy Chief Constable designate, both to Police Scotland and at Strathclyde Police. But you need to go back to the records of both Strathclyde, if they're still available or not, and to Police Scotland now from 2013 till this date.
Right. As part of your role as ACC, did you have any role in equality impact assessments or the preparation of equality impact assessments?
Well, depending on what was being undertaken, if events or whatever, then the equality impact assessments would have been completed for each, or ought to have been completed for each one.
Is that something that you had any responsibility for?
If you were involved in cheering gold for an incident, you would have an expectation that an impact assessment would be carried out.
And who would have carried out the impact assessment in relation to Shekobayo's investigation?
I don't know.
Is that something that would have been addressed at the Gold Group meetings?
It probably should have been.
And you've told us that Nicola Shepherd had a role in relation to the community.
Yeah.
Would it have been someone else, one of the other bronze commanders, that would have dealt with equality impact assessments?
Well, if Nicola Shepherd was in a position to carry out an equality impact assessment, then I would expect that's what it would have been undertaken. But
do you remember?
But I don't remember that. I don't remember it being carried out.
But was it commonly done by someone in the Gold Group?
Well, it would be done
at that time.
Sorry, it would be done on behalf of the Gold Group by someone.
Right. Can I ask you a couple of questions about paragraph 341 of your inquiry statement? And I think you say, I think you were asked about training on unconscious bias, and you say here, I don't recollect any training about unconscious bias. It means we're all conditioned in some way, and because of our conditioning, we have a bias towards particular elements, whether that's race, religion, or other elements such as LGBT. And I've asked a number of witnesses if they had any training in unconscious bias. So did you ever have any training throughout your career in that concept?
Well, I can't specifically say that it was focused on unconscious bias, but I've had training in equality and diversity, and I've been on many training courses in which equality and diversity would have been discussed. But whether we had formal training in terms of unconscious bias, I absolutely don't remember that, and I don't remember having training. But because of my role, I was conscious and understood what unconscious bias was and is.
And from your recollection of the training that was given at that time in Police Scotland in 2015, was training given to officers about how to guard against unconscious bias?
I don't know. So fairly obviously officers would go to, you need to check with the training centre, but officers would go to the various courses they were on, right from probationer training all the way up to superintendent, chief superintendent level in the organisation. So that training would be ongoing. So I don't, I wouldn't have known then exactly what the training was, and I don't recollect it now. So.
Right. I won't ask you any more questions about that. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 345, please? And it may be that you've already answered this question. I've been asked if I know of any examples of discriminatory behaviour in Kirkcaldy. I can't give a specific instance. When I was the deputy at Strathclyde, many incidents would have passed my desk. I can't remember any more specifics, such as who is being discriminated against. I'm not aware of any racist views held by police officers. I've not heard any racist views or comments by police officers. I think, is this part of what you've already mentioned to us today, that you did have a complaint about racist behaviour on your desk at one time when you were in Strathclyde?
Yes, that's right.
And that was a complaint against a fellow police officer?
Yes, that's right.
You say many incidents would have passed my desk. You've said that the one you remember was in relation to a police officer. We've heard evidence that there can sometimes be complaints about racism alleged against police officers by members of the public, people who are accused of offending, as well as by police officers themselves. Do you remember any other examples, perhaps in relation to police officers themselves, other than the one you've given us?
No, I don't remember. I don't.
So in terms of the many incidents that would have passed your desk, who would predominantly have been making those complaints?
So I think when I'm talking about many incidents past my desk, I'm talking more broadly in terms of my role and discipline.
Oh, I see. So many incidents would have passed your desk.
So I think
it wasn't relating to discipline, discriminatory behaviour.
So I think that what I was trying to explain was, there'd be a lot of incidents would have passed over my desk. But I couldn't be more specific about which ones were, in terms of discrimination.
Am I right in saying you were in the Professional Standards Department at one time?
No, I was in charge of the Professional Standards Department for Strathclyde Police. Going back a while.
Were you aware of complaints from that time in your career about complaints of racism by police officers?
I can't be specific about, so that goes back to 2012 or whatever. I can't be specific about what came across my desk. I would be briefed on the many incidents and decisions would be taken about how that was taken forward, but I can't give specific instances at this moment in time. But I'm sure by going back to the records, be able to see how many instances there were and how many reports there were.
Right, thank you. Can I ask you to look at the paragraph 98, please? And it says there are multiple communities. The local community in the Kirkcaldy area would be the starting point. There's also Sheku Bayo's community from his ethnic background. That would be in Kirkcaldy and also nationally. Family can also be a community. Then also a more general community right across the country. They may have views about what happened. I'm interested in this idea about the communities and Mr. Bio's community. Can you explain a little bit more about this paragraph and what you meant?
Yeah, so it's you know, so we wouldn't focus on just one community, understanding what communities they are in the Kirkcaldy area and those that might be impacted. So Sheikh Obaya's community, the black community, you know, focusing on his ethnic background. But that wouldn't be just about Kirkcaldy. But, you know, and what I spoke about there would be a national picture in Scotland, but there would also be a national picture across the UK. And actually, this might impact much wider than that. So it's really understanding where the impact is, and of course, the family themselves, you know, are a community that you would be interested in. We spoke about that, and so every one of them would potentially have a view on what's happened. So we would want to know and understand that from a policing point of view. So it's really it's really diverse, I suppose.
Thank you. Can I ask you some questions about training?
No.
We will be hearing further evidence in this inquiry about training at a later hearing. In your role as Gold Commander, did anyone ever express concern to you in relation to, in the context of the death of Mr. Bio and the investigation, about the adequacy of officer safety training or even first aid training that was provided to officers at that time?
No, not at all.
No. Do you remember any questions or concerns or views being expressed about whether the officers had received adequate training?
No, not at all.
Or whether they'd received adequate training in issues of equality and diversity?
No, I don't recall that at all.
I think you deal with training from your own perspective in from paragraph 18 in your inquiry statement. I don't need you to look at that. You've told us, I've asked you specifically about unconscious bias training.
Yeah.
Had you received specific training prior to May 2015 about racial discrimination?
Well, as not as a one-off course, but I assume that that on the many courses that I've been on, that there's been discussion, but not as a specific bespoke training course.
And when you say you assume, is that because your recollection isn't clear, or?
I've been on so many training courses that, you know, over a 33-year period, that I can't recollect what was at each training course. But you know, there would have been training in relation to each aspect of that. My job, my interaction with people, my interaction with communities, would allow me to garner information. So you start with a training course at a training school or wherever we go, and then by the work that you do, you enhance your understanding of whatever aspect of community or it is that we're dealing with.
Thank you. Had you had any training in relation to institutional racism?
So it's exactly the same answer again. So specific bespoke training course, probably not, but all of these things would be discussed at various different courses, various different forums that I attended. And for many of the groups that I attended, as I already spoke about, the advisory group, the strategic advisory group, these are things that have been brought up and brought to our attention quite forcibly. So.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I asked you about this yesterday. I think I did. I see it's here in my questions again.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, at any time did the Gold Group meeting consider the possibility of the Health and Safety Executive being brought in
No.
to assist or support PERC?
No.
No. There was never any discussion about that
We
as a
never-
possibility?
No, you know, as I said, it's stabilise, hold everything, and ask the PERC to come and carry out the investigation. No.
Thank you. Can I ask you to consider the media engagement at the time of Mr. Bio's death? Looking back now, do you have any concerns about the way the police service handled the media at that time?
Yeah, we need to go back and have a look at exactly what's happening. But from my perspective, you know, the less said to the media at that point, the better. You know, so it's a holding statement at the beginning anyway. It's a holding statement, and it's to acknowledge that the inquiry's been handed over to the PERC. You know, and it may well be that for specific reasons we want to enlarge on that or engage the media for specific reasons about, you know, witnesses or whatever that is. But you know, we need to think about that really carefully.
Did you have any concerns about information that was being put out into the media or on social media about Mr. Bio?
Well, no information should have been being put out, or very little information should have been being put out, apart from the fact that we had the incident and that the PERC was carrying out an investigation. That would be the preferred route.
And if it had been up to you, is that something you would have not put out much information about Mr. Bio?
That would be my preference, but as I said, you know, there might be a debate or that we ought to put out some statements in terms of witnesses so that we get a better understanding of what's happening. But this is not, you know, so it's not different to many other inquiries where at the very beginning, till you get a proper understanding of what's going on, you know, and this is a holding statement that you require at the very beginning, so very little information at that stage. And that, of course, that might expand, but from our police perspective, hand over to the PERC, and then it's for the PERC then to engage with the media if that's indeed what's required.
And looking back now, and obviously we've spent quite a bit of time going over some of the circumstances. Perhaps I've explained to you some of the detailed evidence we've heard. I've asked you to comment on that. And looking back now at the way the investigation was conducted and matters progressed, do you overall have concerns about the way this was handled by the police?
So I think we could have managed it better. It may well be that I should have been more intrusive in terms of some aspects of what was going on. But as I say, you know, what I was trying to do, what I was trying to achieve was, and I keep repeating myself, I'm sorry, but is the holding pattern and being able to hand over to the PERC. So, you know, we're trying to do what we can, but as little as we can before we've got that independent, objective oversight into what's happening.
Could you give me a moment, please, because I'd like to address the chair on a matter. I'm aware now that it's after 4 o'clock, and if you don't mind. I wonder if it would be possible for us to rise now. I would like an opportunity overnight to reflect on some further questions. I don't anticipate I'll take very long tomorrow, But I'm also conscious that there may be Rule 9 applications tomorrow morning, and I would like an opportunity to speak to the core participants about that before I conclude my examination. And I wondered if it would be possible to rise slightly early today. Sorry,
I think I'd muted my microphone. Sorry, I think that's an entirely sensible approach. So, Mr. Nicholson, would you return tomorrow, because there may be some further questions for you. We'll then adjourn now until tomorrow at 10 o'clock.